the rise of intense dogfights and strategic bombing during the First World War, all major air forces of the interwar period knew that wielding swift and superior air power would be the key to avoiding future military deadlocks. Many new tactics had to be applied in the midst of combat operations, where innovation was a matter of life or death.
When you go to war, you learn lessons very quickly. The problem is most generals are fighting the last war. So the French in particular in the Battle of France, which is really May to June of 1940, they are still fighting the First World War. Standing air patrols, 12 aeroplanes, flying around looking for the enemy. The British had already realized that would not work. You don't have enough fuel, you do not have enough aeroplanes. What you need to be able to do is to position your aeroplanes into the right place. Luckily for the British, perhaps unluckily for the French, our leaders also knew that if you gave the squadron commander in the air or the flight commander in the air enough time to use his own abilities, you could actually change the way the battle was fought. So over Dunkirk at the end of May, beginning of June 1940, we started to develop tactics. People like Sailor Malan, he very quickly started to adapt his tactics. He first met Bf-109s, the enemy, the Luftwaffe, over the Low Countries at the beginning of the Dunkirk campaign. It's probably the first recorded Spitfire and Bf-109 engagement. It wasn't very conclusive, nobody was shot down, but the other side got to understand the maneuvering characteristics of each person's aircraft. And that's important because if you're a pilot and a fighter leader, you start to learn tactics based on the enemy's tactics and the enemy's abilities. So you change what you do. So the lessons of the First World War almost are discarded. You don't have standing patrols. What you do is you put your aircraft into the right place and you give mission command to the guy in the air. He's there, he can see what's going on. You might have radar, you might think you know what's going on. It's the guy in the air who needs to have it. What you then need are pilots who can exploit that.
There's a number of changes within fighter tactics during the Battle of Britain, and they need to be done quickly because if you're the one to fall behind in experience in combat, ultimately you place yourself at the most danger. So one of the key advantages that the Luftwaffe had at the beginning was flying in what was known as the Schwarm. So the RAF was sort of fixed in this Vic formation where you have one flight leader out in front and two wingmen flanking him almost like an arrowhead. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, have already started to figure out more flexible flight formations. So already in the Spanish Civil War, they'd been looking at what was known as the Schwarm. So the Schwarm is later known by the RAF as the Finger Four. And this sees two pairs, or Rotten, basically fly in a staggered formation. And this was really important compared to the Vic because it allowed for greater flexibility so the aircraft are less likely to collide with each other. They've got a more open space to operate in, but also they've got a better view of the horizon when trying to spot enemy fighters. So this is a really important technique that is brought into the Battle of Britain. The RAF, of course, respond in kind and start to change their own formations to make sure that they are coming up against the Luftwaffe Schwarm effectively.
Leadership was essential for the implementation of new tactics. Section leaders trained and shaped their subordinates, and the deaths of key commanders could radically change the performance of a squadron.
Every section will have a single pilot as its section leader, and the pilot traits in Scramble have the opportunity to impact some pilots on a purely individual level, but there are also other personality traits that have or spread their influence across an entire section. So it will be the responsibility of the player to identify the pilots in their squadron who are most capable of accentuating the strengths of the rest of the pilots that they go into battle with. At the beginning of a campaign, the squadron leader will be presented with a roster of pilots who may be well-trained and somewhat experienced. But as the battle progresses, just as it did in history, pilots will inevitably be lost, and the player will have to infill with reservists or with pilots with very little training. And in those moments, it should become apparent quickly which pilots have a combination of traits that make them excel in combat, and also which pilots have a combination of traits that may help them excel as section leaders despite a limited amount of flying time.
Battlefield experience in the interwar period gave the Axis a crucial edge early in the war. The Condor Legion's combat experience from supporting General Francisco Franco and his fascist nationalists in the Spanish Civil War gave the Luftwaffe a crucial edge early in the Battle of Britain.
The advantage the Luftwaffe had was that they had been fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Britain was neutral, France was neutral in that war. So we didn't pick up the lessons that the Germans picked up. And they picked up lessons very quickly. Close formation flying is all very good for the Hendon air pageant, but it doesn't work in combat. So in combat, what you want to be able to do is to see the sky in front of you to pick out the enemy. If you're flying in finger 3, like this, with the leader here, second here, third here, your problem is that these two guys, number 2 and number 3, are looking only at the leader to maintain formation. What you want to be able to do is to have as wide a space as possible, perhaps as much as a mile. So let's say 1.5 to 2 kilometers in distance. 4 aeroplanes, 2 and 2. So all of you can be scanning for the enemy, above, below, because you never know where they're going to come from, and especially from behind. The tactics evolved. The British decided perhaps they would have the 2 least experienced pilots at the back, and they would weave to look behind them. And this, sadly, was a death sentence for these pilots, because almost all of them died, because first of all, they were flying slower, and secondly, they weren't able to maintain the integrity of the formation. And they would be the first ones picked off by the Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom had flown in Spain, so had developed the tactics which they now employed. So these were really competent fighter pilots, which is why their aces scored many more victories than the British ones on the Royal Air Force side. The other thing that starts to happen in the Battle of Britain is that the strong-willed leaders, Malan, Stanford, Tuck, Darley, people like these, decide we've had enough of the textbook of the number 1 attack, Vic formation. It looks good in an air display. It's a death sentence when you're in the air. So rather, what you should be doing is being flexible.
We've also got to bear in mind that there is debate within the air forces themselves about the best way to conduct this campaign. And one of the most controversial aspects for the British was the big wing theory from Duxford. So this was very much backed by Douglas Bader and Trafford Leigh-Mallory in terms of making sure that you are throwing up as much aircraft as possible in order to make sure that you are overwhelming the German forces. So this is sending up about 60 aircraft in one go, equivalent to 5 squadrons. The psychological impact of doing this is relatively sound. You want to really scramble your enemy and make sure that he can see this safety in numbers for fighter command. But the problem with it, of course, is that if you underestimate the strength of your opponent and your aircraft are wiped out of the sky, you have less reserves. So as a result, you've got to be careful to make sure that you are conserving your aircraft. And this was very much the argument of Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding and Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who made sure to conserve their aircraft in the Battle of Britain. But of course, the big wing really captured the minds and the hearts of certain aspects of the RAF who want to stage this dramatic defence. And ultimately, this really caused some ill feeling in the RAF, both during and after the Battle of Britain.
In Scramble, fighter organisation is based on real history. You will feel the limitations and sting of early war mistakes and see the RAF improving with experience.
At the beginning of every dogfight in Scramble, airplanes will be organized into the formations that were represented at that point of the Battle of Britain. And then as the dogfight progresses, the Air Force that had positioned themselves in a dogfight that gives them a superior tactical advantage will likely find that they are finding more success.
Attrition and experience taught the RAF several painful lessons. The survivors of defeats incorporated new tactics and closed the gap with the Axis powers.
Other pilots like David Darley at 609 Squadron, the Auxiliary Air Force Squadron at Middle Wallop, he decided that where he wanted to be was right at the back. Not because he was some way scared or wasn't leading, but he felt he could control his squadron. So he'd have 11 other, maybe 12, sometimes as many as 15 aircraft up in front of him. And he could direct them. He could say, A flight, attack there, B flight, attack there. And then you had others like Bader and Stanford Tuck, who believed in, and Kinkham was another one who believed this, that what you do as a leader is you take your formation to the enemy and then you attack. And you might just do one pass, everybody firing, break up the bombers. If the bomber stream is broken up, they're less likely to hit their targets. And then just go out of it. Don't stop to dogfight. Other pilots preferred dogfighting. So you have all these differences. This is good because if you have too many tactics that are the same, the enemy can very quickly adapt to you. But the enemy had no idea that which squadron they were coming up against and what tactics would be employed. So a leader has to not only be charismatic and a really good pilot, he also has to be able to think on his backside in the air and decide where to put his aircraft and how. They would spend time when they'd come down talking about the combat, saying, how can we do it better?
One of the other key dogfighting techniques that was seen with Spitfires and Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain was the process of Spitfires aiming for German fighters, which were of course faster and more manoeuvrable, and then moving Hurricanes over to attack the bombers. Now, this wasn't always uniformly enforced, but it was an important means of showing how there was this sophisticated consideration about what was the best way to bring down the German invaders of the skies. For the Germans, the stakes are particularly high because they need to get back to occupied France. They cannot afford to bail out under any circumstances. And this leads to some really creative, evasive maneuvers and techniques to get back. So Major Hans Eckhard Bob, for instance, creates this technique to bob across the channel. And this is when you've got engine trouble with your Bf 109. So you leave the engine on as long as you can, even if it's overheating, and then you switch it off and glide. And then you switch it on again as far as you can, and then you glide. And ultimately, eventually, you should be able to drift over. But you can imagine how perilous this was over the English Channel, knowing that you could be down there in those waters at any moment.
There are brilliant photographs of number 19 Squadron at Falmere in Cambridgeshire at the latter part of the Battle of Britain, where you see the squadron commander, Sandy Lane, and people like Grumpy Unwin, one of his top pilots, and they're discussing who should do what and who should lead. And eventually, Flight Sergeant Unwin becomes the leader because he has the most aggressive tactics. And it's a really interesting way of going about. It's a whole study in itself of how you lead fighter aircraft in combat in the Battle of Britain.